Today we're going to talk a little bit about mining data from documents. Documents can be anything from field reports to diaries to government documents and those types of things. And they're a great way to gather some really good information. Observation, interviewing, and mining data from documents. That's the way we gather our information in qualitative research. We don't develop surveys, we don't create and schedule experiments, we don't coordinate content analyses. Here we are taking a more interpretive approach as we study what is and how it all interacts. Obviously, these documents we are examining were created for something other than research. We are looking at a census, minutes from meetings, official reports, memoirs and diaries, and other such documents. And because in this case we are not interviewing or observing individuals, we take out all emotion. We aren't beholden to schedules, and we have more flexibility in terms of time. It's as you gather the documents and gather the data, you can look at it on your leisure. Documents are generally more accessible, again because we aren't dealing with time schedules, but this does require that you'll be more imaginative and resourceful because you have to consider what documents will answer your research questions, how those documents relate, and which ones will tell the story. This is a list of documents and artifacts you might be evaluating. Notice that you could be looking at transcripts from radio or television shows, or you could be looking at their SEC filings. You also may be considering the images presented in photographs because that can give you an idea of how some organization may see the world. Again, be imaginative, be creative. Drawing on the anthropological roots of qualitative research, you also may be looking at physical materials and artifacts. Think about the ancient world. Lots of their art and lots of their communication took place on things like water jars. You can learn a lot about those cultures and those individuals based on these artifacts. Also think about erosion and accretion. In the natural world, erosion is where land washes away. Accretion is an increase by natural growth or by gradual external addition. You might think the same thing about population. If you were doing city planning, for example, you might evaluate census reports, tax records, and seek trends. The development of industry to determine why a population has increased or decreased, because that is going to help you understand what you need to do in your planning. You also will be generating your own documents, your logs, your television viewing diaries, the exams you might have prepared and distributed as part of your study, those types of things. You'll be examining these too, so as you're setting up your study, be sure to have all you need when you start. You don't want to start asking questions or making evaluations and then halfway through realize you forgot something, because you're either going to have to go back to the beginning and find that information again so you have consistency between subjects, or you're going to have to punt that idea altogether. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these types of documents? Well, for public records, obviously they're public and generally easy to get a hold of. But you may also run into roadblocks if the data is sensitive and be forced to file a public records request, and that could take some time. And you could get tomes of information here, which is going to take some time to evaluate. Personal documents, these obviously will provide some great insight into your subjects, but they are personal, and thus you're really going to have to build some trust with the subjects in order for them to share them with you. Popular culture documents, these are again readily easy to access and can tell you a lot about the culture, but they are also incredibly limited in terms of timeliness. Think about how often trends change. Visual artifacts. Again, these are very easy to access, but imagine you were examining documentaries about World War II. One documentary can take up to 2 hours to watch, and that's if you're simply watching it. You're going to be taking notes and evaluating, so these can be time-consuming. Physical material and artifacts. How much do you know about Greek mythology and language? Not much? Me neither. That means you're going to have to rely an awful lot on experts, which means you're going to have to spend some time doing some research on the experts to verify authenticity, and then you're going to have the time of scheduling with them. And finally, researcher-generated documents. You generate them, so that's good. You'll know how to read them and you can develop your own shorthand. But you have to be consistent and remember, you are developing these from your own perspective, so naturally they are going to skew the way you see information. Thus, it is going to be imperative that you recognize and check your biases. When you're evaluating documents, you need to first consider if it's primary or secondary research. Primary means you are the one actually doing the research, or at the very least, you are reviewing what a research has completed. An example of this would be reading an article in a scholarly journal. Secondary research is a collection of information that is aggregated from other sources. Textbooks are an example of secondary research. They compile data from other sources as a means of educating students. Of course, your data collection is going to be guided by your research questions and your hypotheses, or educated guesses or hunches. If it doesn't relate to your study, don't waste your time evaluating it. You also need to look at emerging findings of your research. So if you've determined if your data is relevant, you need to consider if it's authentic, if it's current, if it's being presented by appropriate and credible sources. And then you need to code the documents as you search for themes and commonalities that might tell the story. Of course, as with any research methodology and data collection process, you're going to have strengths and weaknesses. Again, most documents have not been developed for research and thus may not be concerned with things like validity or reliability. The data doesn't have to be generalized to a larger population, nor does it need to be replicated because it's focused on one specific case at one specific time. That's fine, but you need to be aware of this so that you don't try and find commonalities between studies with two different populations in two different settings. And think about paintings, movies, television shows, and that like. They certainly aren't developed for research, but they can tell us a lot about the culture and the communication process. Other documents will be germane to a specific industry. If you ask me to evaluate documents from a hospital that detail the process by which blood and tissue samples are protected, distributed, and cataloged, I can bet I'm going to be clueless about the terminology. Someone is going to have to explain this to me. And if it is out of my sphere of consciousness, I'm going to have to spend a good amount of time verifying the sources of authenticity. Now, before you give up on this idea of qualitative research, let's talk some positives. Again, documents are easier to access because you don't have to worry about someone else's schedule. This can also save you a lot of time. Historical data is already here, you just have to collect it, and if you go to a library or museum, the curators are going to be individuals of invaluable resource. Documents can provide a lot of detailed descriptive data that allows you to follow trends, and this all can help you verify hypotheses or even advance your hypotheses, which you could even develop into a theory, but that's a discussion for another time. Finally, because you aren't altering reality by being present, this is a great way to collect data. Some would argue that even if you don't interact with the subjects at all when you are observing, or you're altering reality just by being there, because that is not normal, and thus subjects will subconsciously act differently, at least for a while. But when you are mining for data through documents, you're not going to have to alter environment at all. It's not like the photos or films are going to change their behavior, right? And of course, as we are now in the 21st century, we need to consider online data. I remember when I was working on my PhD, I was taking a content analysis class, and a number of my classmates were also taking a qualitative research class. They came to class bleary-eyed every evening because they were up all night playing World of Warcraft. I asked how they could be playing video games at night while they were studying for their PhD. They informed me they were evaluating communication among players across the globe in an online gaming world. I was fascinated. It was a really interesting study, but it showed how games and online data sources can be a great way of gathering information for a qualitative study. Again, you have some limitations I've detailed here. Keep these in mind as you're considering online data. Finally, as with all research, we have some ethical considerations. You may not be observing people or talking to people, but can you think of anything more personal than an individual's diary or email correspondence? If you're examining academic records, keep in mind that more often than not, you are going to be dealing with minors. These are critical things to consider. It is imperative that you ensure confidentiality and security so that these documents are not seen by the wrong people, especially in these days of identity theft. And last but not least, you have to determine what is for public consumption, such as transcripts and minutes from public meetings, and what is private, again like a diary or a personal memoir. I'm going to say here that if I had my druthers, I'd do interviews 7 days a week and twice on Sunday. I just love talking to people and getting their stories. It's just the journalist in me. But I also find brainstorming to determine what documents would be useful to be quite stimulating. In fact, if you're going to do a lot of interviewing, you're going to have to get good at data mining so you have intelligent questions to ask. So there you go. Start mining that data and building your study. Okay, so that's a brief overview of data mining and through documents. You have a section in your text that deals with this. It's going to go a lot more into detail than what I've discussed here, but I wanted to give you a general idea of what we're looking at, some of the pros and cons of data mining versus observation or versus interviewing, and to see how those two interrelate so that they are great ways of gathering information for your qualitative study. Again, this can be very fun. It can be very challenging, but it also helps you to develop those creative juices and let those flow. So start mining that data, like I said, and good luck with your study.